The police officer looked at me like I was insane. Behind him, the HOA president stood with her arms crossed, smirking like she had already won. 3 squad cars surrounded my campsite by the lake. My lake. The lake I owned on my own property. "Sir, you need to pack up and leave immediately," the officer said. "You are trespassing on community property." I held up my property deed with shaking hands. The paper felt worthless in that moment, even though it clearly showed I owned every inch of this land, including the pristine lake where I had pitched my tent. "Officer, this is my property. I have the legal documents right here." The HOA president stepped forward, her voice dripping with authority. "He is lying. This lake belongs to our community. We have been managing it for 15 years. That was when I realized the truth. They had not just been using my lake without permission. They had been charging their residents fees for access to my private property. They had been committing fraud for over a decade, and I was about to expose every single lie. I never thought I would be the type of person to buy a ranch. Growing up in the city, the closest I got to nature was the small park across from my apartment building. But after 23 years of corporate life, something inside me had broken. The endless meetings, the office politics, the constant pressure to do more with less. I was drowning in a sea of spreadsheets and conference calls. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my cubicle, staring at the same quarterly report I had been working on for 3 weeks, when I realized I could not remember the last time I had seen a sunset. Not through an office window, but really seen one. Standing outside, feeling the air on my face, watching the sky change colors without glass between me and the world. That weekend, I started looking at property listings, not houses in subdivisions or condos with HOA fees. I wanted space. I wanted silence. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be human again. The ranch was perfect. 47 acres of rolling hills and dense forest, with a crystal-clear lake sitting like a jewel in the center of it all. The previous owner had used it as a weekend retreat, and it showed. There was a small cabin that needed work, but the land was pristine, untouched, peaceful. I spent every penny of my savings and took out a loan that made my accountant nervous. But the moment I signed the papers and got the keys, I felt something I had not experienced in years: hope. My first camping trip to the property was magical. I pitched my tent 50 feet from the lake shore, where the morning mist would roll across the water like something from a fairy tale. The silence was so complete it felt like being inside a cathedral. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon. I built a small fire pit using stones from the lake shore. The wood crackled and popped as the flames danced against the growing darkness. Above me, stars appeared one by one, more stars than I had ever seen in my life. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. For the first time in decades, I slept through the night without waking up worried about work. I woke up to the sound of birds singing and deer drinking at the water's edge. The coffee I made over the campfire tasted better than anything I had ever bought from a fancy shop. I could see the distant lights of a housing development through the trees on the far side of the lake, but they felt like they belonged to another world, a world I had left behind. This was my sanctuary now, my slice of heaven that no one could take away from me. I spent 3 days fishing, reading, and just sitting by the water. I did not check my email once. I did not answer my phone. I just existed in the moment, feeling my soul slowly coming back to life. When I finally packed up to go home, I was already planning my next trip. This property was going to save my sanity. It was going to give me back the parts of myself I had lost in the corporate world. I had no idea that my peaceful paradise was about to become a battlefield. 3 weeks later, I returned to my lake for another camping weekend. The stress from work had been building again, and I needed the peace that only this place could provide. I loaded my truck with camping gear, fishing equipment, and enough food for a long weekend of solitude. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, temperature in the mid-70s. I set up my tent in the same spot as before, built another fire pit, and settled in for what I hoped would be an even better experience than my first visit. I was sitting by the fire, watching the sun set over the water, when I heard the distant hum of electric motors. Golf carts. Multiple golf carts approaching through the trees. The sound grew louder and more aggressive, like a swarm of angry bees heading straight for my campsite. My heart sank. I knew these carts were coming from the housing development I could see across the lake, but why were they coming here? This was private property, my private property. 4 golf carts emerged from the tree line in formation, like a military convoy. They surrounded my campsite with military precision, their headlights creating a harsh glare that hurt my eyes. The lead cart stopped just 10 feet from my tent, and out stepped a woman who looked like she had been preparing for this confrontation her entire life. She was in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair that had not moved despite the bumpy ride through the forest. She wore a crisp white polo shirt with some kind of official-looking logo and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her expression was a mixture of disgust and righteous anger. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly do you think you are doing on our lake?" I stood up slowly, trying to process what was happening. "I am sorry, but this is my property. I own this land and this lake." She let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "I do not think so. This lake is a community amenity for Lakeside Estates residents only. You are trespassing, and you need to leave immediately." The other golf cart occupants climbed out and formed a semicircle around me. 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in the same official-looking polo shirts. They looked like they had done this before. They looked like they enjoyed it. "I have the property deed in my truck," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I can show you the legal documents that prove I own this land." "We do not care about your fake documents," the woman snapped. "I am Janet Morrison, president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. We have been managing this lake for 15 years. We maintain it, we stock it with fish, we keep it clean. You cannot just show up here and pretend you own it." I walked to my truck and retrieved the folder containing my property deed, survey maps, and title insurance documents. My hands were shaking as I opened the folder and pulled out the deed. The legal description clearly showed that I owned all 47 acres, including the lake. Janet barely glanced at the papers before dismissing them with a wave of her hand. "Anyone can fake documents these days. What you cannot fake is the fact that we have been using this lake as a community amenity since 2008. That gives us squatters' rights." "That is not how property law works," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "Oh, I think it is," Janet said, her smile turning predatory. "You see, we have lawyers too, and we have 15 years of documented lake maintenance, community events, and resident fees collected specifically for lake access. What do you have? Some papers you probably printed at Kinko's." One of the men stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of aggressive posture that was meant to intimidate. "You need to pack up your stuff and get out of here. Now, before we call the police. You are also in violation of multiple fire safety regulations," Janet added, pointing at my small campfire. Open fires are not permitted within 500 feet of the lake. That is a $500 fine. This is insane, I said, looking around at their faces. They were completely serious. They genuinely believed they had the authority to fine me and kick me off my own property. What is insane is thinking you can just move in here and take over our community lake, Janet said. Pack up your tent, put out that fire and leave. If we see you here again, the police will arrest you for trespassing. I looked at my deed again, then at their determined faces. I was outnumbered 5-1, and they clearly had no intention of listening to reason. My peaceful weekend was ruined, and I was facing the possibility of arrest if I refused to leave. With my heart pounding and my face burning with humiliation, I began packing up my campsite. As I folded my tent and loaded my truck, the HOA members stood watching me like prison guards. Janet made notes on her clipboard, probably documenting my trespassing for their legal files. As I drove away from my own property, I caught a glimpse of Janet in my rearview mirror. She was smiling and taking pictures of my license plate. The war had begun, and I had just lost the first battle. I did not sleep for 3 days after the confrontation at the lake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Janet Morrison's smug face and heard her voice telling me I was trespassing on my own property. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid, but underneath the shame was something much more dangerous. Anger. Pure, focused anger that demanded action. I called in sick to work and spent the next week transforming my dining room into a research center. I spread property maps across the table, printed copies of every document related to my land purchase, and began digging into the history of Lakeside Estates HOA. The first thing I discovered made my blood run cold. According to county records, the Lakeside Estates development had been built in 2007, not 2008 as Janet had claimed. But more importantly, the original development plans showed that the lake was never intended to be part of their community amenities. The lake sat entirely outside their property boundaries. I pulled up satellite images from Google Earth and traced the property lines using the legal descriptions from my deed. There was no ambiguity. The lake was mine, every inch of it. But if the lake did not belong to the HOA, why had they been using it for 15 years? And more importantly, how had they gotten away with it? I spent the next 2 days digging through public records at the county courthouse. What I found there made me sick to my stomach. The previous owner of my property, an elderly man named Robert Chen, had been fighting with the HOA about lake access since 2009. The court files showed a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and legal threats that had gone on for years. According to the documents, the HOA had started using the lake shortly after the development was completed. When Mr. Chen complained, they filed nuisance lawsuits against him, claiming he was interfering with their residents' established recreational activities. They had buried him in legal fees and court appearances until he finally gave up fighting. The most damning document was a letter from Mr. Chen's lawyer to the HOA, dated just 2 years before I purchased the property. It stated clearly that Mr. Chen was allowing HOA lake access under extreme duress and without any legal obligation to do so. He had been coerced into submission, and the HOA had taken his reluctant permission as legal authorization. But the evidence got worse. I found HOA meeting minutes going back to 2010 that discussed lake maintenance expenses and aquatic facility improvements. They had been charging their residents monthly fees for lake access, fees for using my property. I printed every document and organized them into folders by date and type: trespassing evidence, financial fraud evidence, harassment evidence. The case against the HOA was building, but I needed more. I drove to the lake at dawn, parking my truck a quarter-mile away and hiking through the woods with binoculars and a camera. What I saw made my hands shake with rage. They had built a boat ramp on my property, a permanent concrete boat ramp that extended 20 feet into my lake. Next to it was a wooden dock with built-in benches and a fishing station. On the far shore, they had cleared trees and created a small beach area with picnic tables and a fire pit. I took hundreds of photographs, documenting every structure they had built on my land without permission. Each photo felt like evidence in a criminal case, which is exactly what this was becoming. That afternoon, I called the law office of Patricia Williams, a property attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her consultation fee was $200, but I would have paid 10 times that for the validation she provided. "This is one of the clearest cases of criminal trespass I have ever seen," she said, flipping through my evidence folders. "They have not just been using your property without permission. They have made permanent improvements to it and charged residents for access. That is fraud." "What can I do about it?" I asked. "You have several options," she said, leaning back in her chair. "You can sue them for trespass and demand they remove all structures from your property. You can report the financial fraud to the district attorney, or you can do both. What would you recommend?" She smiled, and for the first time in weeks I felt hope. "I would recommend we document everything they do from now on. Every illegal entry onto your property, every fraudulent transaction, every threatening communication. Build an airtight case that ends this permanently." "How do we do that?" "We set a trap," she said. "We give them enough rope to hang themselves." I walked out of her office with a legal retainer agreement and a plan for revenge. The HOA thought they had intimidated me into giving up. They had no idea they had just created their worst nightmare. Patricia Williams and I spent the next month preparing for war. Every detail had to be perfect because we would only get one chance to expose the HOA's illegal activities in a way that would end their harassment permanently. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would return to my property for a weekend camping trip, but this time I would be ready for their confrontation. More than ready. I would be armed with cameras, witnesses, and legal documentation that would turn their own aggressive tactics against them. The first step was installing trail cameras throughout my property. I purchased 8 high-definition cameras with night vision and motion sensors. Patricia helped me position them to capture every possible angle of approach to the lake. We hid cameras in trees overlooking the boat ramp, the dock, and the beach area they had illegally created. We placed cameras along the main trails they used to access my property from their development. Each camera was programmed to start recording the moment it detected movement and to automatically upload footage to a cloud storage account. Even if they found and destroyed the cameras, the evidence would be safely stored off-site. Next, I reached out to my brother Mike and 3 of my closest friends. I told them the entire story and asked if they would be willing to spend a weekend camping with me as witnesses to whatever was about to happen. All 4 agreed immediately, and Mike brought his own camera equipment to document everything. "This is insane," Mike said as we loaded camping gear into 2 trucks. "These people actually think they own your lake." "It gets worse," I told him. "They have been charging their residents monthly fees to use it. They are making money off my property." My friend Dave, who worked as a paralegal, had helped me prepare a complete evidence package for the confrontation. We had copies of my property deed, the survey maps, the county records showing the HOA's trespassing, and photographs of all the structures they had built on my land. Everything was organized in clear plastic folders and duplicated in case they tried to destroy the evidence. The most important preparation was my conversation with the local sheriff's department. I called the non-emergency line and spoke with Sergeant Rodriguez, explaining that I was being harassed by an HOA who falsely claimed to own my property. "They have threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on my own land," I told him. "I am going to be camping there this weekend, and I expect they will call you to have me removed." "Do you have documentation proving you own the property?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked. "I have the deed, the survey, and title insurance. I also have evidence that the HOA has been illegally using my property for over 15 years. "Bring copies of everything with you when you camp," he said. "If we get called out there, we will want to see the documentation before we take any action." Friday afternoon, my brother and friends met me at the property. We set up 4 tents in a semicircle near the lake shore and built a large fire pit using stones from the beach. I wanted our campsite to be visible and obvious. I wanted to make sure the HOA could not miss us. As we set up camp, I walked them through the evidence we had gathered. I showed them the boat ramp and dock the HOA had built without permission. I pointed out the cleared beach area and the picnic tables that sat squarely on my property. I explained how the HOA had been charging residents for access to facilities they had no legal right to use. "This is definitely your land," my friend Sarah said, looking at the survey map. "These people are criminals." "That is exactly what they are," I agreed. "And tomorrow we are going to prove it." That evening, as we sat around the fire roasting marshmallows and telling stories, I felt a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement. I had spent so many years avoiding confrontation, trying to keep peace at work and in my personal life. But this was different. This was not just about me anymore. This was about standing up to bullies who had been terrorizing property owners for over a decade. Mike pulled me aside as we were banking the fire for the night. "Are you sure you want to do this? These people sound dangerous." "I am sure," I said, looking out at the moonlight reflecting on the lake. "If I do not stop them, they will keep doing this to other people. How many property owners have they intimidated into giving up their rights? How many people have been too scared to fight back?" "Just promise me you will stay calm tomorrow," Mike said. "Do not let them bait you into doing something stupid." "I promise," I said. "This is not about anger anymore. This is about justice." As I lay in my tent that night, listening to the gentle sounds of the lake and the distant calls of night birds, I felt more at peace than I had in months. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but I was ready. I had the law on my side, evidence to support my case, and witnesses to document everything that happened. The HOA had no idea what was coming for them. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful. We made coffee over the campfire and fried bacon in cast iron pans while the morning mist rose from the lake. My brother and friends were relaxed and laughing, treating it like a normal camping trip. But I kept checking my watch and scanning the tree line for movement. At 10:30 a.m., the trail cameras sent their first motion alerts to my phone. 4 golf carts were approaching through the woods, moving in formation like a military strike force. I alerted my friends and positioned everyone according to our plan. Mike started recording with his video camera, while Dave and Sarah took positions where they could document everything with their phones. Janet Morrison emerged from the lead golf cart like a general leading troops into battle. She was accompanied by 6 other HOA board members, and this time they had brought reinforcements. 2 county sheriff's deputies followed behind them on foot, looking annoyed and tired. "There he is," Janet announced, pointing at me like I was a wanted fugitive. "Officers, this man is trespassing on community property. We want him arrested immediately." Deputy Martinez, a young Hispanic officer who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, approached our campsite with his hand resting on his radio. "Sir, we have received reports that you are camping on private property without permission." I pulled out my evidence folder and handed him my property deed. "Officer, this is my property. I own this land legally and have the documentation to prove it." Deputy Martinez studied the deed while his partner, an older officer named Deputy Chen, examined our campsite. The HOA members formed a semicircle around us, whispering among themselves and pointing at our tents. "This appears to be a legitimate property deed," Deputy Martinez said, looking confused. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation showing that your HOA owns this land?" Janet stepped forward with her clipboard held high like a shield. "We do not need documentation. We have been managing this lake as a community amenity for 15 years. That gives us legal rights to the property." "That is not how property law works," Deputy Chen said, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had dealt with HOA disputes before. 15 years of use without permission is still trespassing." "These people are lying," Janet insisted, her voice rising to a near shriek. "This lake belongs to Lakeside Estates. We maintain it, we stock it with fish. We have insurance policies covering it as a community asset." I felt my heart rate spike. Insurance fraud. She had just admitted to insurance fraud in front of 2 police officers. "Ma'am," I said, pulling out my camera and showing her the photos I had taken of their illegal structures. "If you maintain this lake, then you built this boat ramp and dock on my property without permission. That is criminal trespass and destruction of private property." Deputy Martinez took my camera and scrolled through the photos, while Deputy Chen examined the boat ramp in person. The mood of the conversation was shifting rapidly, as the officers realized they were dealing with something much more serious than a simple property dispute. "Sir," Deputy Chen called out, "how long have these structures been on your property?" "According to county records, they started building on my land in 2009, I said, handing him the folder of HOA meeting minutes. "These documents show they have been charging residents monthly fees for lake access. They are making money from illegally using my property." Janet's face turned red as she realized her authority was crumbling in front of her residents. "Those documents are fake. This man is trying to steal our community lake." "Ma'am, I am going to need you to calm down," Deputy Martinez said, his voice taking on the firm tone officers use when situations start getting out of control. "Sir, do you have your survey maps showing the exact property boundaries?" I unfolded the official survey and pointed to the lake boundaries. "The entire lake sits within my property lines. The HOA development ends here, about 200 feet from the water's edge." Deputy Chen walked the boundary line using his GPS unit while the HOA members watched in growing horror. When he returned, his expression was grim. "The survey is accurate. The lake and all structures around it are on this gentleman's private property." "That is impossible," Janet screamed. "We have been using this lake for 15 years. Our residents pay fees for lake access. We have community events here every summer." "Ma'am, that is called trespassing," Deputy Martinez said. "And if you have been charging people money for access to property you do not own, that could be considered fraud." The word fraud hit the HOA members like a physical blow. Several of them took steps backward, and I could see panic starting to set in. They had not expected their intimidation tactics to backfire this spectacularly. "Officers," I said, "I would like to file a formal complaint for criminal trespass, property damage, and fraud. I have 15 years of documented evidence showing systematic illegal use of my property." Janet made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You cannot do this. We have lawyers. We will sue you for everything you own." Deputy Chen looked at her with the expression of someone who had finally lost patience. "Ma'am, based on the evidence presented here today, your HOA appears to have been engaged in criminal activity for over a decade. I suggest you contact your lawyers immediately, because you are going to need them." As the deputies began taking formal statements and collecting evidence, I watched the HOA members' confidence collapse completely. Their small kingdom built on intimidation and illegal land use was falling apart in real time. Justice was finally being served, and it tasted sweeter than I had ever imagined. The aftermath of that Saturday confrontation spread through Lakeside Estates like wildfire. By Monday morning, 3 more property owners had contacted Patricia Williams with similar stories of HOA harassment and intimidation. By Wednesday, a local news station was filming a segment about HOA abuse of power. By Friday, the district attorney's office had opened a formal investigation into the Lakeside Estates HOA. I spent that week working with Detective Sarah Kim from the County Fraud Division, providing her with boxes of evidence we had collected. The scope of the HOA's illegal activities was staggering. They had been charging residents $45 per month for lake access fees since 2009. Over 15 years, that amounted to more than $120,000 in fraudulent charges for access to property they did not own. "This is one of the most clear-cut fraud cases I have seen," Detective Kim told me. "They documented everything themselves: meeting minutes, financial records, insurance claims. They basically built the case against themselves." The HOA's insurance fraud was even more serious than their trespassing. They had been filing claims with their liability insurance company for lake maintenance and aquatic facility improvements for over a decade. When a child was injured on their illegal dock in 2018, they had filed a claim that resulted in a $75,000 payout from their insurance company. "Insurance fraud is a felony," Detective Kim explained. "Each false claim is a separate charge. Janet Morrison and the other board members are looking at serious prison time." The legal proceedings moved faster than I had expected. Within 2 weeks of filing the criminal complaint, the district attorney had issued warrants for the arrest of all 7 HOA board members. The charges included criminal trespass, fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Janet Morrison was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning. The local news cameras captured her being led away in handcuffs, her perfectly styled hair finally showing signs of distress. The image became the lead story on 3 different news stations. The other board members surrendered to police over the following days. Some tried to claim they had been deceived by Janet and had not known they were breaking the law. But the meeting minutes and financial records showed they had all been active participants in the scheme. The civil lawsuits began almost immediately. Patricia Williams filed a lawsuit on my behalf seeking damages for 15 years of illegal use of my property, plus the cost of removing all structures they had built without permission. We calculated the fair market rental value of the lake at $2,000 per month, which meant the HOA owed me over $360,000 in back rent. But the real satisfaction came from watching the HOA's financial empire collapse. When news of the fraud investigation became public, dozens of residents demanded refunds of their lake access fees. The HOA's legal defense costs quickly drained their reserve funds, and they were forced to implement emergency assessments just to pay their lawyers. The community revolt was swift and decisive. At an emergency HOA meeting held 3 weeks after the arrests, the residents voted unanimously to remove the entire board of directors and elect new leadership. The new board's first official act was to send me a formal letter of apology and an offer to negotiate a settlement. The physical removal of the HOA's illegal structures was almost as satisfying as their arrests. A crew of workers spent 4 days dismantling the boat ramp, dock, and beach facilities they had built on my property. I insisted on being present to document every step of the process. Watching the boat ramp being demolished felt like watching a prison wall come down. Each piece of concrete that was hauled away represented years of illegal intimidation and harassment. The workers found buried electrical lines and water pipes that the HOA had installed without permits or permission. The scope of their trespassing had been even more extensive than I had realized. The media attention brought contact from property owners across the county who had faced similar harassment from their HOAs. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate for property rights, giving interviews about the importance of standing up to abuse of authority. "The key is documentation," I told a reporter from the county newspaper. HOAs count on people being too intimidated to fight back. But when you have the law on your side and evidence to support your case, bullies become very small very quickly. The financial settlements came 6 months later. The HOA agreed to pay me $295,000 in damages for their illegal use of my property. Individual board members also faced personal liability for their roles in the fraud scheme. Janet Morrison, as the ringleader, was ordered to pay an additional $50,000 in punitive damages. But the money was never really the point. The point was justice. The point was making sure no other property owner would have to face the kind of intimidation and harassment I had experienced. The criminal trials concluded 8 months after that first confrontation at the lake. Janet Morrison was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay $180,000 in restitution to the insurance companies she had defrauded. The other board members received sentences ranging from probation to 6 months in jail. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the judge read the sentences, I thought about all the property owners who had been too scared to fight back over the years. All the people who had been bullied into submission by Janet Morrison and her HOA board. Today was their victory too. The gavel came down with a satisfying thud, and 15 years of fraud and intimidation officially came to an end. 2 years have passed since that first confrontation with the HOA, and I am sitting by my lake again as I write this. The morning mist is rising from the water just like it did on that first magical camping trip, but everything feels different now. The peace I feel is deeper, earned through struggle, sweetened by victory. The lake looks exactly as it did when I first bought the property. All traces of the HOA's illegal structures have been removed, and nature has begun to reclaim the areas they had cleared. Young trees are growing where their picnic tables once sat. The shoreline where their boat ramp extended into the water has been restored to its natural state. This morning, I am not alone. My brother Mike is teaching his 8-year-old son how to cast a fishing line from the shore. My friends Dave and Sarah are setting up a second campsite for their family weekend getaway. The property has become what I always dreamed it would be, a sanctuary for the people I care about, free from harassment and interference. The new HOA leadership reached out to me 6 months after the trials concluded. The new president, a retired teacher named Margaret Phillips, called to formally apologize for what their previous board had done to me and to ask if we could establish respectful boundaries between our properties. "We want to be good neighbors," she told me during our phone conversation. "What happened to you was wrong, and we want to make sure it never happens again." We met at a coffee shop in town and had a civilized conversation about property lines and mutual respect. The new HOA board had implemented strict policies about respecting private property and had established clear consequences for board members who abused their authority. "The previous board gave HOAs a bad name," Margaret said. "We are trying to rebuild trust with the community and prove that homeowner associations can serve their residents without becoming bullies." I appreciated their efforts, but I remain cautious. Power corrupts, and HOA boards seem particularly susceptible to the temptation of overreach. I keep my legal documents in a fireproof safe and maintain good relationships with the local sheriff's department, just in case history tries to repeat itself. The story of my battle with the Lakeside Estates HOA has been shared thousands of times on social media and property rights websites. I receive emails regularly from people facing similar battles with their HOAs. Some ask for advice, others just want to share their stories of intimidation and harassment. I try to respond to as many as possible, always with the same message: document everything, know your rights, and do not let bullies intimidate you into giving up what is legally yours. The law is on the side of property owners who are willing to stand up for their rights. Last month, I testified before the state legislature in support of a bill that would strengthen property rights protections and increase penalties for HOA fraud. The bill passed overwhelmingly, and the governor signed it into law 2 weeks ago. It is now called the Property Owner Protection Act, and it includes specific provisions inspired by my case. Patricia Williams, my attorney, has built a thriving practice representing property owners in HOA disputes. She tells me that the publicity from our case has helped other victims find the courage to fight back against abuse of authority. "You started something," she told me at our last meeting. "HOAs across the state are being much more careful about overstepping their boundaries because they know property owners are willing to fight back now." As I watch my nephew catch his first fish from my lake, I think about the cost of justice and whether it was worth it. The legal fees, the stress, the months of preparation and confrontation, was it worth it to reclaim this peace? The answer comes as soon as the question forms in my mind. Yes, absolutely yes. Not just for me, but for every property owner who has been bullied by corrupt HOA boards. For every person who has been intimidated into giving up their legal rights. For everyone who has been told they are powerless against institutional authority. Sometimes you have to fight for what is yours. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they have clipboards and official-looking polo shirts. Sometimes justice requires courage, preparation, and the willingness to see a battle through to its conclusion. The sun is setting over my lake now, painting the water gold and orange. My family is gathering around the campfire, and the sound of their laughter carries across the water. This is what I fought for. This moment of perfect peace, earned through struggle and protected by law. The war is over, and the good guys won.